Hello, I'm David Hilborn. I'm Principal of Moorlands College in the UK. And my topic for this workshop is understanding and evaluating the discourse of spiritual abuse. Now, the first thing I want to say is that this is a topic which deals with phenomena which are delicate and difficult, and for many people who come across them, really problematic. So I want to say to you that if anything that we cover in terms of the sinful activities that come under the discourse of what is often called spiritual abuse, but a discourse that I want to sort of refine and move on from. If anything that is mentioned is disturbing to you and actually requires you to tell somebody else or work with somebody else on those issues, then please do seek out trained help and responsible help. I can't know your particular situation. The forum covers the whole of the continent of Europe and brings in people from North America and elsewhere. So it really does have to be a kind of general advice to seek that help out. But can I urge you to do that if anything here chimes with your experience and you need to work on that as a victim. And indeed, if this is harder to say in a way, but if you're someone who suspects that you might have been guilty of some of the things that I cover in this workshop, then please also do seek help and guidance for that. Now, having said that, I just want to point out that this recording has been made subsequent to the live workshop that I presented at the ELF in May 2020. And the reason for that is that the equipment failed us and we weren't able to get a clean and full recording of the workshop that was delivered online, as the whole of ELF was at that time because of the coronavirus. And so what I've done at the request of the leadership team at ELF is to re-record this. And I've taken the opportunity to go into a little bit more depth in certain areas because I've had a lot of requests about what I said back in May, and to sort of unpack some of that stuff. And so I've taken the opportunity to do that, given that this is a re-recording. So you'll find that it's in two parts. In the first part, I explore the discourse of spiritual abuse as it's developed over the last sort of 30 years or so. I look at the history, I look at the work that's been done subsequently and more recently around more academic contexts on it. And then in the second part, I evaluate that discourse and that definition from what I would want to say is a more profoundly and richly theological perspective than has been attempted by much of the literature on it so far. I want to sort of open up the understanding of abuse in religious contexts, which is not particularly physical or sexual abuse, but which is more psychological. And I want to suggest a different kind of language to describe the same phenomena, roughly, that are covered in the language of spiritual abuse, but to offer something, I hope, a little bit more kind of layered and nuanced to go forward with. So I hope that's helpful to you. I've split this into two parts, so you can take a break after about first chunk, and then we come back and do the analysis and critique and evaluation and look to the future. So I hope that's useful to you, and I will now pass on to the recording of the seminar itself. This is the terminology of spiritual abuse that has proliferated in recent years and has become quite widespread. I want to make it clear that the phenomena that it is taken to describe are clearly phenomena that have no place in a healthy Christian church. The phenomena that are included in this nomenclature are phenomena like bullying, manipulation, coercion, domination, authoritarianism, exploitation, manipulation, and so forth. And really, we need to call those out. There needs to be a concerted effort to ensure that these are not continued as abuses of power in congregations and in Christian settings. Having said that, just because the phenomena exist and are wrong doesn't mean that the terminology is the most helpful terminology that we might use. And one of my tasks in this workshop is to examine and critique actually the terminology of spiritual abuse as not the most helpful kind of language that we can use to describe these sinful activities. And I will be very clear and upfront in saying that these activities clearly are sinful. Now, this particular recording is a re-recording of the live workshop I did present at the forum in the spring. And the reason it's had to be re-recorded is because there was a technical issue with the recording at the time. The session was very helpful to many people. I've heard that from them, but there was an issue with the actual recording. So we haven't been able to reproduce the live workshop, but I'm re-recording this for all those who have asked me to do so. It does mean that the live Q&A that took place back in May 2020 is not part of this, but if there are queries, I would be more than happy to field them and to direct anybody who has questions to others, or to answer those questions myself insofar as I'm able to do so. So through the forum office, please do lodge questions if you have them, and I'd be very happy to answer them in that way. Now, my focus and my context is in the UK, as I said, and much of my field of reference in this talk is going to be to the UK setting, but that doesn't mean that there's not quite a lot that can be read across from the British circumstance that I'm in to other European countries, and indeed across to North America and elsewhere, because this concept of so-called spiritual abuse is being racked up, it's being intensified in many different quarters. Again, to make the distinction, the phenomena we're describing of abuse of power, manipulation, bullying, etc. are wrong and need to be called as such. But the way they're described and diagnosed in the language of spiritual abuse is something more of a contentious matter, and I'm going to just explore the contention and some possible solutions to it as we move through. Now, one of the key contexts for the growing interest in and discussion of spiritual abuse at the moment is the context in which the cases that have come to light around sexual abuse in the clergy and in Christian leadership have thrown light on wider abuses of power that can sometimes be described with the language of spiritual abuse. So to give some examples that will be perhaps familiar to many of you of those sex abuse scandals that have kind of also carried in their slipstream some concerns about the non-physical, psychological, spiritual, mental dimensions of what's gone on. I could cite, for example, the case of Theodore Edgar McCarrick, the Roman Catholic cardinal, who in the USA in February 2019 was convicted of sex crimes against adults and minors, and in fact turned out to be the most senior official in the Catholic Church to be laicized in modern times. In fact, demoted from cardinal to the status of layperson, which was pretty much unprecedented move against his sinful activity. Or in our own UK context here, Cardinal Keith O'Brien, Archbishop of St Andrews in Edinburgh in Scotland, who resigned following publication of allegations that he'd engaged in inappropriate and predatory sexual behaviour with priests and seminarians under his care. Along with that went accusations of the abuse of his power and of non-physical effects in mental health terms and spiritual terms on those who suffered that abuse. Likewise, in the Church of England, my own denomination, Bishop Peter Ball, who set up a community for young men and ran it as a kind of religious house in a more Anglo-Catholic tradition, was sentenced in October 2015 to 32 months imprisonment for misconduct in public office and indecent assault after he admitted abuse of 18 young men within that community setting. And it's something that still rumbles through the Church of England, as we'll see. There is in the UK context, there is an independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, ICSA, which in recent times has taken in quite a lot of scrutiny of different church denominations, their policies around child sexual abuse, and those historic cases that I've mentioned. It was initially catalysed by the case of Jimmy Savile, a celebrity, much lauded, did a lot of charity work, not least for children's charities, who after his death was discovered to have been a horrific child sexual abuser. But the inquiry has extended into an investigation, as I say, of various Christian churches and other religious organisations. And in the kind of slipstream of all the sex abuse scandal that it's investigated, there has been the beginnings of a discourse of spiritual abuse that has kind of gone hand in hand, it's assumed, with the physical abuse that has been perpetrated, the sexual abuse by those Christian leaders. Now, along with that kind of context and background of sexual abuse has come an increased statutory focus, not only in the UK but elsewhere, on bullying, hate, coercion and control, which are expressed verbally or might be expressed, at least we could say non-physically, in leadership, not least religious leadership. So in Britain in 2006, Religious and Racial and Religious Hatred Act was passed, which consolidated a developing concept of hate speech within British law, and which took in the sort of verbal abuse of others, not least with sort of religious connotations. Actually, as things panned out, the legislation around that was extended from religion to belief in the more general sense, even including agnostic and atheistic belief. And the law ultimately in that case decided it wouldn't be able to single out religious people as perpetrators of a particular kind of hate speech or a worse kind of hate speech than anything else, or indeed non-religious people abusing religious people. It became really a law about hate speech more generally in all quarters of society. And that becomes quite significant for what I'm going to say about attempts to put spiritual abuse on the statute book as we move through. Now, in 2018, this notion that bullying, hate speech, coercion, control should be put into the frame of criminal activity was given a real sort of intensification around that last phrase, coercion and control, which had been confined up to that point very much to the informal description of domestic abuse, the abuse that a husband might perpetrate on a wife or vice versa, or partners who weren't necessarily married within a domestic context. What's happened since the law was toughened up and coercion and control was made a criminal offence within the wider sphere of abuse, and particularly domestic abuse, is that some have argued that it can be extended beyond the home into the church context, or indeed the religious arena. So coercion and control, as we'll see, which is now a criminal offence in the British context, is very much part of the evolving discourse of spiritual abuse. And we'll look again at the consequences of that extrapolation from the domestic to the ecclesial context in a moment. Now, this proliferation of the language of spiritual abuse alongside other forms of abuse like physical, sexual, psychological and emotional abuse, which are the key forms of abuse, at least in British law, along with neglect in the case of child neglect. This proliferation of spiritual abuse discourse has had some key kind of proponents and key drivers. One of them, it has to be said, is the legislation that has risen up around safeguarding. This is particularly, again, a response to the horrific cases of child abuse that I've mentioned, and those and many others, unfortunately, as well. And both in terms of statutory provision and more informal guidance around institutions that have a duty of care to children and vulnerable adults, there has been a tremendous push in the last decade or so in Britain on safeguarding children and vulnerable adults from abuse of various kinds. Safeguarding is defined by the British government as the process of protecting children and vulnerable adults from abuse or neglect, preventing impairment of their health and development, and ensuring that they are growing up in circumstances consistent with the provision of safe and effective care. One of the drivers for that intensification of work around safeguarding was indeed a really horrendous case called the Victoria Climbié inquiry in 2003, in which religiously based abuse of a child was wrapped into physical abuse of a child. So you see why people make the connection, but as we shall see, it doesn't necessarily mean that the concept of spiritual abuse is the best way to describe and indeed to address these phenomena of manipulation, bullying, psychological disintegration, coercion, and so forth. And in the church context, there are a couple of agencies in particular that have taken up the baton and the challenge of addressing safeguarding and ensuring safeguarding is properly administered within the church. 31.8 is one of them. Previously, the organisation was very much focused on protecting children, but now has extended its work to the adult arena as well. And then also Christian Safeguarding Services, a more recent evangelical agency that is providing checks to ensure that people are fit to lead charities that have children involved and vulnerable adults, so-called DBS checks in Britain, and which is also doing training and education around that, as does 31.8. Now, another driver of the growing conceptualization of spiritual abuse comes really from the early 1990s and has kind of morphed into a much broader idea. Let me explain. So in the early 1990s, particularly in some new church movements that were influenced by the renewal movement, the charismatic movement of the 1970s and 80s, both in America and here in Britain and elsewhere, there were some expressions of so-called house church Christianity and renewalist Christianity that made a great play of so-called heavy shepherding, very intense discipling, with tremendous obedience paid to a recognized leader or pastor. And along with that went sometimes really quite sort of pressured requirements to tithe, obligatory tithing, and decisions made about, you know, which partner one would take up a relationship with and who one would marry and that kind of thing. Heavy shepherding was the key concern around that period of the late 80s, early 90s. And that spawned, particularly in the American context, a number of books that addressed this under the nomenclature of spiritual abuse. So spiritual abuse is not a recent new concept in terms of just the last few years. It has its origins as a concept in that sort of particular evangelical, mainly charismatic space of the early 90s. And so we see books published in 1991, for example, by David Johnson and Jeff Van Vonderen, called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, by sort of evangelical publishers like IVP and Zondervan. In 1992, following up on that, Ronald Enros, Churches That Abuse, and his own 1994 sequel to that called Recovering from Churches That Abuse. And also then from IVP, Ken Blue, Healing Spiritual Abuse, How to Break Free from Bad Church Experience in 1993. So again, let me stress that the concept of spiritual abuse as such is not something that's only just risen up in the last 3 or 4 years. But what I do think is important to stress is that the context has changed. Those books were very much sort of what I would call intra-evangelical pastoral guides to the avoidance of heavy-handed leadership, authoritarian leadership, which might go along with manipulation and bullying and unbiblical practices, which put too heavy pressure on people about giving money, who they should be partnering up with, and that kind of thing, leading into sort of accusations of sectarianism and cultic behaviour. But it was a concern within the evangelical family largely. The turning point in the whole kind of racking up of concern about spiritual abuse came when a psychologist, not a theologian, a psychologist called Lisa Oakley, and another psychological researcher called Catherine Kinmond decided to do research on this phenomenon in the early 2000s. And Lisa Oakley, she and Catherine Kinmond decided to, in Lisa's case, she did a PhD on this subject, and at Manchester Metropolitan University began to teach on it. And that led to a book called Breaking the Silence of Spiritual Abuse, or On Spiritual Abuse, which was published in the year 2013. This was the fruit of all that work that they did through the first decade of the 21st century. And it was published by Paul Grave Macmillan, which is a reputable academic publisher. So it gave that kind of that respectability in academic circles to a concept which hadn't really been explored with that degree of academic intensity before. And this then led to a more popular publication called Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse that Lisa Oakley published in 2019, along with the CEO of 318, Justin Humphreys. So you've got two people who don't come out of theological academia, one a psychologist, one somebody trained in the sort of leadership of charitable work, particularly and focused on children, but also vulnerable adults and safeguarding and so on. And that then has given a boost to this concept of spiritual abuse, and it's kind of mainstreamed it to some degree. And it's really that more recent expression of it that I want to focus on particularly, but it's helpful to know where the roots come from. Now, what is somewhat concerning, I have to say, is that this work on these phenomena, which are, again, let me stress, sinful and wrong and should be called out, of manipulation, abuse of power, bullying, and so forth within the church, authoritarianism, etc. They have been taken up by certain folk who are deeply hostile to what I want to call classic evangelicalism, a historic, authentic biblical expression of the Christian faith, which is associated particularly with the Protestant Reformation and its theologies, and with the development of that through the revival movements of the 18th century and through the 19th into the 20th and 21st centuries. Mainline historic evangelical faith. For instance, Jane Ozanne, a campaigner for gay marriage within the Church of England and for LGBTQ rights and lifestyles within the Church of England, has appropriated the terminology of spiritual abuse to condemn really the whole range of evangelical, charismatic and Pentecostal theological expression, insofar as it takes a traditional classical view of biblical marriage being between a man and a woman for life. Richard Scorer, a solicitor who is much used by campaigning humanist groups, atheist campaigning groups, has aligned with the National Secular Society to take up Ozanne's cause and to target various evangelical groups in particular as almost intrinsically, inherently spiritually abusive. There's not much differentiation or distinction. That whole form of Christian expression is taken to be intrinsically problematic. Intrinsically problematic because it is prone to spiritual abuse in and of itself. So for Jane Ozanne, in 2017, she presented a paper for the Royal College of Psychiatrists, which linked evangelical and charismatic spirituality to spiritual abuse, and particular abuse related to the sexual ethics of those traditions. And she called for hate crime legislation to be filtered through the idea of spiritual abuse and to be linked to the notion of spiritual abuse, to criminalize, really, to prosecute those who took a traditional view, not least of sexual ethics, and to tag them, brand them as spiritual abusers. It really was that broad brush, her critique in that lecture. There are other sort of difficulties and problems with the nomenclature, the discourse of spiritual abuse, that I think are worth exploring, even with that important qualification. I keep stressing it, that the phenomena of authoritarianism, bullying, manipulation, and so forth are wrong and need to be revealed as wrong and need to be addressed as wrong within the church and beyond the church if they rise to the level of criminal activity. We'll come to that in a moment. One of the big problems with clustering all of these phenomena into the catch-all term spiritual abuse is that it uses the term spiritual. Now, that may be something that has traction within church councils and committees and elderships and presbyteries or whatever, but it doesn't really play in a coherent way in a secular, pluralist, democratic society in which those who enforce the law and those who work to do that as police officers or social workers, and those who are responsible for legislating, politicians, and those who then dispense the law, lawyers, judges, etc., in which many of those people have no particular allegiance to or understanding of things of the spirit, of religion, or indeed specifically of Christian faith and practice or Christian theology. And what it seems to be happening in this attempt to move the concept of spiritual abuse from, as I say, an inter-ecclesial pastoral concern to the law, to a realm of criminal activity, is that those who are behind that kind of campaigning, Lisa Oakley, Jane Ozanne, Richard Scorer, and others, do not understand that it's just unworkable for a secular legal system to begin to arbitrate on these matters of spiritual and theological difference and distinction. So to take an example, the statutory attempt to define religion and spirituality around hate speech, as I've said, in 2006, had to morph into a general prohibition against hate speech against any belief, even if it's non-religious, because actually singling out religious or spiritual people for criminalization is discriminatory. It's discriminatory. Of course it is, because you're saying there's a particular law only for the religious or the spiritual person, as over against the person who doesn't claim to have religious or spiritual allegiance. And that may be something that is of great concern to church bodies and church councils, but expecting the criminal law to arbitrate between one expression of spirituality and another, one expression of Christian leadership and another, is deeply problematic. There are more general categories of abuse in the law. I've mentioned them, which, you know, particularly around psychological and emotional abuse, might indeed catch those who are perpetrating that within a church context, just as it should catch anybody who perpetrates the abuse of power anywhere. But to single out the spiritual person or spiritual leaders for this particular form of criminality is incoherent and indeed prejudicial. John Garvey, in his anthology of modern spirituality, rightly points out that when you try to define spirituality in any case, it becomes quite a problematic area. Indeed, he says that the concept of spirituality as a kind of standalone phenomenon is a relatively modern development. The idea that you could divorce spirituality and make it a generic term distinct from particular churches' liturgies or doctrines is deeply difficult to capture, because it would have been incomprehensible to a reforming theologian in the Protestant Reformation to talk about spirituality as if it's some commodity that you pick off the shelf, distinct from Christian doctrine and church membership and so forth, to make it a kind of generic term for anybody who worships anything or believes in anything, say, supernatural. So we've got that problem of a vague and indistinct language which is being used potentially to criminalize people. And whilst, as I say, the content and phenomena which are indicated by the term spiritual abuse may be very, very serious, there is an issue about whether this is the right terminology and discourse to be used. Another problem with this whole kind of language of spiritual abuse is what I call neo-Erastianism. Now, that does need some unpacking. So Erastus was a Zwinglian Protestant reformer who lived in that sort of Reformation period, the first generation of reform from 1524 to 1583. And he operated in that space and very much was committed to the connection between the church and the state. And he believed, actually, quite extremely, even among the reformers, that the government, the state, the magistrates should take on the role of church discipline, that they should be disciplining people within churches, not just for general civic crimes like murder or stealing, but also for particularly doctrinal heresies that might actually be debated by the different theologians of the Reformation. But he made it very, very clear that it would only work, that sort of legislation of spiritual and religious things and theological contraventions, if you like, would only work when one particular form of religion, one particular version of Christianity even, was established, was very much part of the law of the land, okay, where you had a theocracy, basically. And he was also very, very clear that when you didn't have a theocracy, this was inappropriate, because people who have different expressions, even within the same religion, will disagree on what constitutes wrongful belief and wrongful practice. And indeed, they might even coercively use the idea that the state should punish heresy to discriminate against those that disagreed with them theologically. And so he was very, very clear that it was only appropriate for the state to arbitrate specifically spiritual issues or religious matters where the state was a theocracy, where it was running a theocracy, and where only one type of religion was established. And of course, in the modern world, that doesn't really apply. Even in my context, in the Church of England, we talk about the Church of England being established, but there's a pluralism of religion. There is a diversity of religion. And in no way does the Church of England in the 21st century expect the government to legislate, or it hasn't done for something like 300 years, expect the government to legislate on doctrinal matters or matters that do not rise to the level of criminal law that apply to everybody being equal under the law. The problem with spiritual abuse is that for some of its proponents, it's moving towards, in a kind of legal mission creep, it's moving towards criminalizing particular expressions of spirituality. It's using this term spirituality, so it's making it out to be a distinctively religious problem which the state should legislate for. And that is, I think, a really, really awkward move and fraught with issues which we'll explore in a moment. In response to all of this, a couple of years ago, I and some others on the theological advisory group of the Evangelical Alliance UK put together a response to the growing discourse of spiritual abuse called Reviewing the Discourse of Spiritual Abuse. This is online, available free of charge as a PDF on the Evangelical Alliance's website. And much of what I'm going to say from here on in really is based on that particular report. And I'd strongly commend that you do read it, because it's the leading, I mean, I'm trying to be modest here, but it is the leading countervailing voice against this move to criminalize something called spiritual abuse. Not to in any way downplay the seriousness of the manipulation, authoritarianism, bullying, abuse of power that is clearly, and has always been, but is particularly prominent in public imagination now, but actually to question the diagnosis and the analysis and the language of this concept. So I've already said that the initial context for using the terminology of spiritual abuse was an intra-evangelical context around domination and bullying and the misuse of ecclesial power, particularly within sort of house church type communities from the 80s through into the early 90s. And Johnson and Van Vonderen, authors of one of the very first books on this phenomenon, define spiritual abuse in that particular frame as the mistreatment of a person who's in need of help, support, or greater spiritual empowerment, with the result of weakening, undermining, or decreasing that person's spiritual empowerment. But in their view, the job of arbitrating on this was sort of higher church courts and councils. Only should that abuse of power result in sort of criminal psychological abuse, should it rise to that level, and then the pastor or leader who perpetrated it would be dealt with like any other person in a work context or a charitable context or a secular public service context. Would they be prosecuted for that? And as I say, the closest corollary in existing UK law to this notion of spiritual abuse is the existing category of emotional and psychological abuse. And one of the key arguments of the Evangelical Alliance document is that really in the category of emotional and psychological abuse that exists already, there is perfectly sufficient material to take somebody who is an abuser, a psychological abuser that isn't necessarily perpetrating physical or sexual abuse, but doing so within the church context, to law, to take them to court and to call them out in that context. But when we attach the term spiritual to something, it suggests that there is something particular and distinctive, which then perhaps is within the church space. As we'll see biblically, there are particular things that are distinctive to Christian non-physical, non-sexual abuse, which are important. But to use the term spiritual abuse and expect it to be picked up by statutory authorities is problematic for all the reasons that I've mentioned. The other thing to say is that psychological abuse itself in UK law is a subset of the crime known as common assault, which doesn't have to be physical. It can be non-physical and applies to adults. In British law, emotional abuse tends to apply to children and psychological abuse to adults, but it amounts to pretty much the same thing. The other move that's being made, as I've mentioned, is to extrapolate from the domestic context of coercion and control, or coercive control, which has been on the statute book as a criminal offence since 2018, into the ecclesial space, and to see spiritual abuse as a sort of form of what a husband might do to a wife, or a wife to a husband psychologically in that domestic setting, which is a sort of mental disintegration and dissolution of confidence and so forth, and empowerment. Again, that's moving towards a criminalization. Now, what's interesting is that, of course, in recent times, there have been plenty of examples of psychological abuse that have hit the headlines that aren't anything to do specifically with spirituality or religion. For example, the Me Too movement, emerging from Hollywood, but now very much a global phenomenon, spoke not only of sexual harassment, although that's very serious, and sexual abuse, but also of the psychological damage that is done by people in positions of power who abuse that power in the entertainment industry, like Harvey Weinstein most infamously of course. In sport, the technical director of British Cycling, Shane Sutton, was relieved of his duties. British Olympic, very successful technical director of the British Olympic cycling team, was relieved of his duties, again for manipulation and bullying and authoritarian behaviour, coercive behaviour, you might say. But that's in the British cycling context, which is thoroughly secular. The term psychological abuse seems appropriate to that. And likewise, the former Speaker of the House of Commons in Parliament in Westminster, John Bercow, was accused, I have to say, accused of, again, bullying, verbal bullying of his staff. Now, what is telling is that all of these phenomena were at one time or another described under the rubric of psychological abuse, but there was no need in those cases to coin a sort of extra qualifier around something like entertainment industry abuse or sporting abuse or parliamentary abuse. On the principle that abuse is abuse, this was non-physical, non-sexual, psychological abuse, and that seemed to be perfectly adequate to describe all these different types of context. Why then is it that the religious or spiritual context in which such abuse might take place wants to be singled out for particular criminalisation? Why is it that those who perpetrate something within a church context, say, or indeed it could be a Sikh or an Islamic or Hindu context, we'll come to that, why is it that somebody in those particular instances needs to have a whole specialized form of criminal activity attached to them when the Harvey Weinsteins and Shane Suttons of this world and people who bully at work are just written off as psychological abusers and might be prosecuted for that? It's an interesting question to ponder. Now, in the work that I've mentioned of Johnson and Van Vonderen, of Enroth and Blue in the 90s, various responses were made to the notion that there had to be a particular category called spiritual abuse, distinct from or complementary to the generic notion of psychological or emotional abuse, or concepts like bullying, for example. Firstly, they said that spiritual abuse was justified by appeal to the divine or to sacred text, or the abusers would justify their action by appeal to the divine or to sacred texts as having divine authority. That they would be, this abuse would be perpetrated by people who had a particular role as pastor or ordained minister or vicar or whatever it was within a particular religious institution. And also that it was perpetrated in settings that would be identified in one way or another as religious. So it would take place within a church building, or it would take place within a church-based youth group or whatever, that the setting was also important to the distinctive definition of spiritual abuse. And then when Oakley and Kinman did their academic study, building on that early work, that intra-evangelical work, and sought to take it more into the sort of secular space, they also use similar concepts. In this definition from their 2013 book, the Breaking the Silence on Spiritual Abuse text, they talk about spiritual abuse as coercion and control, again, anticipating what did become a criminal category later of one individual by another in a spiritual context. And they talked about spiritual abuse as a deeply emotional personal attack, so linking it to emotional abuse. And they used generic terms that could be used in secular contexts like manipulation, exploitation, enforced accountability, censorship, and the like. And I have no problem with those concepts being applied to people who abuse in the church, just as they are applied to people who abuse beyond the church or outside the church context. But they also then get more specific in talking of misuse of scripture or the pulpit to control behavior, and the divine position that Johnson and Van Vonderen talk about as well. So there's a mixture here of general sort of secular discourse around psychological and emotional abuse, but certain terms which have a more religious or perhaps theological weight. And they talk about in the later book, the 2019 book, Escaping the Maze of Spiritual Abuse, Oakley and Justin Humphreys talk about abuse which is coercive and controlling, that terminology again, in a religious context. And they talk about sacred texts or teaching being used as kind of proof texts for the behavior. And they also talk of the divine position of the abuser. So you see, again, the majority of the language in black there is just generic, but there are particular terms that are used to single out spiritual abuse. All of those terms, however, beg quite a lot of questions. Nowhere in Oakley and Kinman's book, nor indeed in Oakley and Humphreys' book, do we have a thoroughgoing, theologically well-founded definition of what a religious context is. Nowhere do they really admit that there are religions that do not have sacred texts. Nowhere do they define what they mean by the divine. And with a plethora of religious expressions all over the world, the question becomes whether they are so focused on their own Christian tradition that they're not taking account of abuse that might occur in other world faiths, in a range of faiths indeed, from, as I say, Islam through Hinduism to Sikhism to Zoroastrianism to whatever else might be out there, Satanism, or indeed Jedi Knight worship, which is classed as a religion in the British census. Now, it's important not to trivialize the actual phenomena that we're talking about, even while there may be many difficulties with the terminology that Oakley and Kinman and Humphreys and others use. I say this because within our own evangelical tradition, not least, there are really quite shameful episodes that need to be exposed and are being exposed, and other cases which are being investigated, and I have to be more cautious about in terms of, any conclusion that might be drawn. But many of you will be aware of the case of John Smythe, an English barrister who was a mainstay of the evangelical Ewan camps, which were set up for schoolboys at elite English public schools, and which featured, in his case, physical abuse through beating and through a very sort of coercive and bullying type of approach to Christian discipleship. And there are many victims who've suffered under John Smythe's leadership in that context. Smythe actually died before he could be brought to court, but there are plenty who have witnessed to the effect on them, not just physically, but spiritually, of his abuse. Mark Stibbe, for example, has written of the deep lasting impact of Smythe's behaviour on him and numerous other victims. Stibbe uses the term spiritual abuse alongside the physical abuse he and others suffered. The problem is, I think, that in Smythe's case, if his behaviour had come to law, he would have been prosecuted under the existing provisions of, no doubt, physical abuse, but also emotional and psychological abuse. But there wouldn't have been much coherence to the idea that he would be prosecuted for spiritual abuse. One, because it doesn't exist in British law, or indeed, as far as I'm aware, in law anywhere else in the world, but also because his behaviour would have fallen into those categories that I've already mentioned that exist in secular law, that are the same for everybody, being equal under that law. Another case is the case of Timothy Davis, who's vicar of Christchurch, or was Christchurch Abingdon in Oxford, who was the first clergy person in the Church of England to be tried by a bishop's tribunal. That's not a statutory legal instrument, but is an intra-church body, who was tried partly for spiritual abuse after having subjected a boy within his congregation to mentoring of such intensity that he was in breach of safeguarding procedures both of the national church, but also of the parish. And the Oxford Tribunal, the Bishops' Tribunal, decided to describe that under this emerging language of spiritual abuse. And then we have the case of Jonathan Fletcher, vicar of Emmanuel Wimbledon, again, a Church of England evangelical leader, who in 2019 was revealed by various press reports to have indulged in what was called manipulative and controlling conduct, including naked spanking and ice baths and massage sessions for a close circle of men who were his followers and his sort of close confidants. This matter is under investigation at the moment through 31.8, so I'm not going to say too much more than that, but it does appear, because Jonathan Fletcher was relieved of his duties in the parish, that there are quite a lot of quite damaged people that have followed in the wake of this behaviour. Steve Timmis, another case that will be quite close to home for many people watching this presentation, CEO of the Reformed Evangelical Network called Acts 29, was removed in 2020 after multiple allegations of what was called bullying and intimidation, overbearing demands in the name of mission, rejection of critical feedback, and an expectation of unconditional loyalty. Again, that is being looked into and hasn't been concluded, and I need to be careful what I say. But the point that I want to make about that case is that the language of spiritual abuse was widely applied to what happened there, and has been picked up, but not least by people like Lisa Oakley and Jane Ozanne and Justin Humphreys, to kind of exemplify the fact that this is a thing, that spiritual abuse is important. Now, I don't deny that the phenomena that are described in all of these cases need to be taken really, really seriously. But here's the thing. I believe that there is a cogent theological, Christian, biblical critique of this type of behavior, which needs to be addressed in that context. And if the behavior also is recognized in the criminal law as being so serious as to deserve prosecution, as anybody would be prosecuted for psychological or emotional abuse, then fine, that should then proceed to that level. But there's a whole panoply of behavior which isn't regarded as criminal in British culture, or indeed most Western cultures, which nonetheless needs to be taken very seriously also, which in some cases actually the work done by Oakley and Kinman and Justin Humphreys ignores, but is all part of the deal from a Christian theological perspective. So let's look at our sacred text. Remember, appeal to sacred text is taken to be one of the features of the spiritual abuse that Kinman and Oakley and Humphreys and others say is rife in the church and needs to be called out. But let's look at this, what our sacred text, the Bible, has to say about really unacceptable forms of behavior that are non-sexual and non-physical in the broader sense, because that would be a genuinely theological approach to this problem. And when we look at scripture, we see that there are plenty of bases for distinctively Christian construal of psychological abuse. In Matthew 23, Jesus sharply criticizes religious leaders who are unduly prone to burden others without supporting them in verse 4, who shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces in verse 13, who insist on petty legalistic observances while neglecting to show justice, mercy, and faithfulness in verse 23. In Mark 10:42 through 43, Jesus contrasts existing Gentile rulers who lord it over those in their charge with faithful Christian ministers who act as servants to those in their care, the very kind of obverse of bullying and abuse of power. In Titus 1:10 to 11, Paul likewise castigates religious empty talkers and deceivers who upset whole families. Abuse not just of individuals, but of families and households through bullying and manipulation. And notice here that though Paul goes on to repudiate those empty talkers and deceivers for teaching things they shouldn't teach, he also frames that within the context of heresy. There is that sense that you can abuse people within the church, and indeed potentially beyond it, by teaching false doctrine, by abusing God, if you like, through manipulating and distorting the truths of the gospel. That bad teaching is also to be called out as a form, if you like, of abuse. That is ignored, that dimension of theological, heretical, false teaching type abuse. That's ignored largely by Kinmond, Oakley, Humphreys and others. And yet it is absolutely, from a theological point of view, at the core of church discipline, which is the existing biblical context in which abuse of this type is to be dealt with and called out. Let's move to Matthew chapter 18. Famously, the teaching of Jesus moves to resolution of disputes within the church between believers. And the context here seems to be an unspecified rift between two members of the church in verse 15, with a background of an appeal made by Jesus that when people do fall out and they disagree with each other and they get angry with each other and they perhaps begin to abuse each other verbally, that there should be a humility which reverts them to a childlike forbearance of each other, back in verses 3 and 4. Jesus talks about the need to resolve these kinds of fallings out, to protect little ones and lost sheep within the flock of the church. Wayne Grudem talks of this whole passage in terms of church discipline being corrective, restorative, and conciliatory, something that the church holds individual believers to account for. A very important precept in dealing with those who are out of line, whose behavior is damaging a congregation. There should be a proper structure in place within the church to hold those people to account. But there is a recognition that in some cases where there isn't repentance, there isn't reconciliation, where the wrong is not confessed and admitted, that there may be a even more severe fate that might await the perpetrator of whatever type of abuse it is, psychological, emotional abuse, heresy, false teaching, bad ethical behavior. And in the rubric of bad ethical behavior, which arises to the level of abuse, is sexual immorality, of course. In the case of 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 13, it seems to be a form of incest, which is described as malicious and wicked yeast in the dough. But the more general framework for that is that sexual abuse does have consequences beyond the mere act of adultery or fornication or whatever it might be, which damages and deeply, deeply harms the victim and deeply harms others in the congregation and the coherence of the community. Paul says that such sexual immorality is akin to greed, swindling, idolatry, slander, and drunkenness in meriting discipline. And here's the thing, no doubt we can include within the list of sexual sins that Paul and others speak about the abuse of children, but there is more to sexual abuse from a Christian point of view in sex outside marriage, sex before marriage, adultery, and the like. These are all regarded as prone to and deserving of church discipline. Again, we don't hear a lot about that when we speak of spiritual abuse, the damage that can be done to relationships within and beyond the church by these forms of sexual immorality. Other sins that require discipline in the New Testament are people who serve their own ends and use the church to do that, and cause divisions as a result, rather than working for the common good of the congregation. We see that in Romans 16, 17 through 18, and such selfish believers are advised by Paul to butt out, to not to harm others within a congregation, and members of the congregation are advised to treat them as those who should not be part of the fellowship. And we see a similar kind of repudiation in 3 John verse 9 of selfishness within the congregation. And then again, there are those who oppose the apostolic message, who teach falsely. In 2 Timothy 4:14, the example there cited is Alexander the metal worker, who strongly opposed the message of the gospel, says Paul. There are others who warp new Christians' faith with, again, false teaching in Titus 3:10. Foolish controversies are stoked up by those who indulge in fruitless genealogies and fruitless arguments and quarrels about the law, which are useless to the health and well-being of the congregation. There are others in 2 Thessalonians 3:11 who are described as busybodies and troublemakers that Paul calls out. And those who show malice towards outsiders and fail to express hospitality towards the stranger and the alien, who also would be guilty of abuse, which would be, if you like, a form of church-based abuse. I've mentioned heresy and false teaching as one of the key forms of, if you like, non-physical or non-sexual abuse within the church that is focused on in the New Testament. Those who deny the grace of God and who perpetrate the notion that by works of the law, such as circumcision, we gain our salvation, are called out for that in Galatians 2:11. That's a form of abuse. Blasphemy, such as perpetrated by Hymenaeus and Alexander in 1 Timothy 1:20, likewise. Stoking doctrinal controversy for profit in 1 Timothy 6:3 through 5. Paul speaks there about those who have an unhealthy interest in controversies and quarrels about words that result in envy, strife, malicious talk, and evil suspicions, with constant friction between people of corrupt mind who have been robbed of the truth. That's a pretty serious allegation, a form of, if you like, theological abuse. Let's put it like that. Those who deny the incarnation are in a similar category in 2 John 9 through 11. Those who are idolaters in Revelation 2:6, as John addresses the community at Pergamum there. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. There are some among you who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin, so that they ate food sacrificed to idols. And then the Nicolaitans, also in the same verse, who are seen as a threat, probably because of their denial of the place of sort of law and ethical parameters within the fledgling church. All of these things, biblically, would come under the category of church-based abuse, if you want to put it like that. And yet they're not things that feature in the discourse of spiritual abuse as it's promulgated today by most commentators, certainly by the sort of second wave of books on this published by Oakley and Kinmond and Humphreys, and also the lecture by Jane Ozanne that I referred to earlier. So as we critique and evaluate spiritual abuse discourse, what are we going to say? We're going to say that it's in danger of neo-Erastianism, of a new form of state coercion of religion, a denial actually of religious liberty potentially, in which the state assumes as a secular pluralist entity to arbitrate disputes between believers about doctrinal matters, which might encourage one party to accuse the other of spiritual abuse when it's an intra-ecclesial dispute. This is the danger of racking everything up into a new category only for religious and spiritual people. As I say, that is deeply problematic. It could be used by opponents of classic evangelical doctrine and ethics, like, I have to say, Jane Ozanne, in her kind of vista of a whole swathe of people who simply teach those classical doctrines and ethical precepts from the pulpit being held to account by the criminal law. It's discriminatory, as I've explained, against religious and spiritual people by purporting to create a special category of wrongdoing, particularly just for them, that again is to be arbitrated not by a church court or a church tribunal, but by the secular law. Religious, spiritual, sacred, all of these terms are not defined adequately and theologically in the literature I've mentioned. There is a muddying of the waters of the category of criminal psychological abuse by introducing this concept of spiritual abuse. And as I say, the literature so far on it is pretty heedless. Certainly that latter phase of literature, pretty heedless of theology and church history, civic discipline, and the biblical construal of what would constitute non-physical and non-sexual abuse. Now, it's true that in Romans 13, Paul says that every person is subject to the governing authorities, and that the governing authorities of a state have been appointed by God, not least for the exercise of discipline and punishment. Even so, through the interpretation of the scripture as a whole down the centuries, there has evolved across many, many very fraught disputes the precious concept of religious liberty. The idea that it is not the job of the state, particularly to arbitrate theological disputes between two factions within a church, a more liberal faction, say a more evangelical faction, that the church must be given freedom to arbitrate its own doctrinal disputes of behavior which don't rise to categories of criminal law that would apply to everybody in a society. John Locke, the great sort of pioneer of and philosopher of religious liberty, made it very, very clear that the magistrate's power should not extend to punishing religious people for specifically religious offences which don't have an application to the society as a whole. They can't do that, particularly in a pluralist secular society such as he was envisaging at the end of the 17th century, as the grip of one particular expression of Christianity in what we now call Anglicanism was loosening in relation to the state in England. Timothy Garton-Ash, in a more modern context, in his book on free speech, 10 Principles for a Connected World, looks at examples of attempts to legislate against religious hate speech in various contexts, various nations, and says that inevitably they end up with bad, anachronistic, inconsistent, vacuous and counterproductive applications of the law, because these days in the modern West in particular, legal systems are secular. They are not set up explicitly to judge particular doctrinal or indeed spiritual matters. They are there for everyone. And again, I keep stressing bullying, manipulation, psychological abuse, emotional abuse. Yes, absolutely. They need to be judged and need to be assessed, if they are that serious, by courts of law. But to create a special category of spiritual abuse just for religious people, then to be tried in their own sort of subset of criminal law, is deeply, deeply problematic. And as I've said, the hate speech legislation in England and Wales, particularly from the early 2000s, ended up really being a law not against religious hate speech, but just against hate speech in the name of any particular philosophy or ideology. There's also a deep concern that if a criminal category is created of spiritual abuse, it will just be used as a weapon, will be weaponized by different religious communities against each other. If they disagree about God, if they disagree about what should be done in the name of God. And, you know, the horrific prospect in a delicately balanced pluralist society such as Britain or say Germany or the United States or wherever, of Muslims taking Christians to law for spiritual abuse because Christians question whether Muhammad was indeed a prophet or not, or vice versa. It could work the other way as well. Really, it just doesn't bear thinking about. And yet that is one unintended but very, very serious potential consequence, I think, of the way that spiritual abuse discourse is going. There's a danger of an interreligious culture war, and we really don't need that in a world which is already riven by a particularly extremist and fundamentalist expressions of violent faith. There is then, I believe, real content to the concerns of those who use the language of spiritual abuse in terms of the phenomena that I've been mentioning, but there is also a real danger of legislative overreach and mission creep. The prospect of secular judges who understand little or nothing of theology arbitrating theological dimensions of abuse is deeply, deeply worrying. A court, however, might well want to sentence an abusive priest for abusing members of his or her congregation or clergy person or church leader because their duty of care is that much greater. But then an atheist pediatric surgeon who abuses a child would also rightly be subjected to a higher degree of sentencing than others because, again, of their duty of care. It's not necessarily a matter of their so-called divine position or status in relation to the hierarchy of church leadership. It is something that can really properly be determined by those who do understand the theological and ecclesiological dimensions of this. So, to conclude, churches might well discipline emotional and psychological abusers over and above the law, because many of the things I've mentioned biblically are just not criminal offences and never will be, not in our society as it stands today. And very frequently Christians, in terms of their ethical behaviour, need to go above and beyond the law. But to create distinctive theological precepts that then are kind of given their own space within the criminal law, again, in a pluralist democratic society, is deeply, deeply problematic. I liken spiritual abuse language to the really amorphous psychological or pseudo-psychological terminology of about 100 years ago that would describe what we now call PTSD as the vapors or shell shock or hysteria. And as the analysis of these phenomena has grown, we use much more precise diagnosis now, such as clinical depression, bipolar disorder, functional neurologic disorders, and as I've already said, PTSD. There is an evolution of terminology required, and I'd say it's required very much in this case, in the case of spiritual abuse. Better diagnosis actually helps victims and survivors in this context. So spiritual abuse discourse really needs, I'd suggest, rethinking, resisting, and replacing. My preference would be that we use the terms psychological and emotional abuse, and we might then talk about their occurring in religious contexts in particular cases, but not, as I say, creating any kind of special legal category for that. Now, in their book on the maze of spiritual abuse from 2019, there is something of an olive branch in this direction offered by Oakley and Humphreys. They actually refer to the Evangelical Alliance report of 2018 that I helped to author. They don't properly footnote it or cite it or discuss it or debate with it as responsible academics would do, but nonetheless they kind of implicitly refer to it and talk about terms like coercive control in a religious context or psychological abuse linked to faith and belief. That's the type of terminology I think is more appropriate. And they do say that they would be prepared to continue to dialogue around that. That would be good to see. But they also then say that they are continuing to plough on with the use of this problematic discourse of spiritual abuse, because they say that's what's being used by survivors of that type of abuse. One of the difficulties with that particular rationale, though, is that the people probably most responsible for intensifying and oxygenating the very terminology of spiritual abuse are people like Lisa Oakley and Justin Humphreys, Catherine Kinmond, Jane Ozanne, and so forth. So in a sense, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, if they publish, if they speak, if they train continually people in safeguarding contexts to believe that spiritual abuse is the best terminology, which they frequently do, then of course people will seize onto that, just as folk will seize on to whatever's out there as an expression of their hurt. I understand that happened with shell shock. It happens with ME, which is still being researched and diagnosed. And as a placeholder term, people will hold on to something that may not be really very, very well defined. But I'm saying that for all the reasons I've laid out here, while we need to take those phenomena very, very seriously, of bullying, manipulation, of authoritarianism and the like, this is not the best language to describe that. So I do hope that offer of further debate and dialogue will be taken up, and that there will be a kind of level playing field to look at this afresh without sort of the snowball effect created by just continuing to use the terminology and to claim that it is the one preferred by victims. There is a better way forward. While we must take these dimensions of abuse seriously in a biblical and theological context, let's try and find a better way. Thank you for listening. As I say, if you have questions, I'd be very, very willing to respond, and you can field them through the ELF administrative structures, which you'll find laid out on the ELF website. Thank you very much for being part of this workshop, and God bless you.